Elijah hadn't expected to spend his Saturday surrounded by pastel balloons and tiny finger sandwiches, but here he was, standing in the middle of his cousin's baby shower, wondering how soon he could make an exit without being rude. Family gatherings weren't exactly his thing, but his cousin Daniel had insisted. "Come on, man. It's just a few hours. Free food, happy people, no stress." Elijah had reluctantly agreed, expecting nothing more than small talk, awkward conversations about his love life or lack thereof, and an afternoon of watching his aunt fuss over baby gifts. What he hadn't expected was her. She moved quickly, weaving through the crowd with effortless grace, her dark waves pulled into a loose ponytail, a few strands framing her face. She was dressed in simple black catering attire, a contrast to the soft blues and creams decorating the backyard. But there was something about her, something that caught his eye and refused to let go. She was focused, adjusting a platter of cupcakes before passing by him without a second glance. He caught a faint hint of vanilla and something floral as she passed. Elijah wasn't the type to be easily distracted, but for some reason he found himself watching her work, the way she checked on guests, the way she smiled politely when someone thanked her. Daniel nudged him. "You good?" Elijah blinked, realizing he'd been staring. "Yeah. Who's the caterer?" Daniel followed his gaze and grinned. "That's Zaria. She owns the catering business my wife hired. Pretty sure she's too busy to notice you gawking." "I wasn't gawking," Elijah muttered, but Daniel just laughed. Zaria. The name suited her. He wasn't someone who believed in love at first sight. Attraction, sure. Interest, maybe. But this was something different. Still, she was working. He wasn't going to interrupt. But fate had other plans. Minutes later, as he stood by the drink station, Zaria appeared beside him, wiping her hands on a towel. She let out a small sigh, barely acknowledging him as she adjusted a stack of napkins. "Busy day?" he asked, surprising even himself. She glanced up, her hazel eyes meeting his. "You could say that." Her voice was warm, but there was a guarded edge to it. "Elijah," he introduced himself. She nodded. "Zaria. But I guess you already figured that out." He chuckled. "Yeah. My cousin mentioned you own the business." "Impressive." Her lips curved slightly, but it wasn't quite a smile. "Thanks. It keeps me busy." Something about the way she said it made him curious. There was a weight behind her words, like this job wasn't just something she loved, it was something she needed. Before he could ask more, one of her assistants called her name. She gave him one last glance before disappearing back into the crowd. Elijah had been to plenty of events like this. He'd met plenty of people. But no one had ever made him feel this. Off balance. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind. Zaria didn't have time for distractions. Especially not tall, ridiculously good-looking distractions with sharp blue eyes and an easy charm. She had a business to run, a reputation to uphold. Every event mattered, and she wasn't about to get sidetracked by some guest who probably wouldn't remember her name by tomorrow. But as she moved through the backyard, refilling trays and checking on guests, she was aware of him. The way he watched her, the way his presence seemed to linger in her orbit. She wasn't used to that. Most people barely acknowledged the caterer. They smiled, took their food, and moved on. But Elijah had looked at her like he actually saw her. And that was dangerous, because she didn't have time for romance. Not now. She had worked too hard to build this business from the ground up. It had taken years of late nights, early mornings, and sacrifice. She wasn't about to let her focus slip because of some man who probably lived a completely different life from hers. Still, when she passed by him again, she caught herself slowing down. Just for a second. And when their eyes met, something flickered in his gaze, something that made her pulse stutter. She didn't like it, but she also didn't hate it. Elijah wasn't one to chase after someone. If things happened, they happened. He didn't force connections. But Zaria intrigued him. By the time the event started winding down, he found himself near the catering setup again. She was packing things up, her sleeves pushed up, revealing toned arms and a small scar on her wrist. He wondered what story it held. "You do this often?" he asked. She glanced at him, arching a brow. "Cater baby showers? More than I can count." He smirked. "I meant work this hard." Her expression softened just a little. "Yeah. It's what I do." There was pride in her voice, but also something else. Something heavier. "You ever take a break?" She let out a short laugh. "Not really. That kind of luxury isn't in the cards for me." Elijah frowned. "Why not?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Because if I stop, everything falls apart." She didn't elaborate, but he could tell she meant it. He wanted to ask more, wanted to know what had made her so determined, so guarded. But before he could, one of her employees called her over. She hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Nice meeting you, Elijah." And just like that, she was gone. But something in his gut told him this wasn't the last time he'd see her. And for the first time in a long time, he hoped he was right. Elijah hadn't planned to see Zaria again so soon, but life had a strange way of throwing people back into each other's paths. It started with a simple craving. His mother had mentioned a cafe downtown that supposedly had the best pastries in the city. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after a long morning of meetings, he decided to stop by. As soon as he stepped inside, the scent of fresh bread and warm cinnamon wrapped around him. The place was small but inviting, with large windows letting in the afternoon sun. A handful of people were scattered across tables, lost in quiet conversation or focused on their laptops. He was halfway to the counter when he heard a familiar voice. Zaria stood behind the register, her hair pulled back into a neat braid, her apron dusted with flour. She was speaking to a customer, her expression focused but calm. Elijah hesitated. He hadn't expected this. She caught sight of him just as he stepped into line, her brows lifting in brief surprise before settling into something more neutral. The customer in front of him finished their order, and then it was his turn. She wiped her hands on a cloth and met his gaze. "Didn't take you for a bakery guy?" He leaned slightly against the counter. "I didn't take you for one either." She glanced toward the kitchen. "I help out here sometimes. The owner is a friend." He nodded, taking in the shelves lined with delicate pastries and golden croissants. "So catering, baking? Anything else I should know?" She tilted her head slightly. "You planning to write a biography?" He gave a low chuckle. "Just curious." She crossed her arms. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who randomly stumbles into small bakeries." Elijah shrugged. "Maybe I'm full of surprises." For the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Maybe." A voice called from the back, and she turned slightly, responding before glancing back at him. "You ordering something or just here to interrogate me?" He glanced at the display case, then back at her. "What do you recommend?" She tapped her fingers lightly against the counter. "The honey lavender scone is good. Not too sweet?" He didn't hesitate. "I'll take one." She rang up his order and handed him a small paper bag. "Enjoy." He took it but didn't step away just yet. "You always this serious when you work?" Her lips twitched. "Some of us don't have the luxury of standing around making conversation." He considered that. "Fair point." Before she could escape back into the kitchen, he said, "You ever take a break?" She hesitated. His gaze didn't waver. Finally, she exhaled. "I get off in an hour." Something shifted between them, an unspoken agreement hanging in the air. "I'll be here," he said simply. And then he stepped away, leaving her watching him for just a second longer than necessary. Zaria wasn't sure why she had agreed. She wasn't in the habit of entertaining strangers, especially ones who had a way of looking at her like they saw more than she was willing to show. But when she stepped out of the bakery an hour later, Elijah was still there, leaning casually against the brick wall, his hands tucked into his pockets. She crossed her arms. "You waited." He pushed off the wall. "Told you I would." She studied him for a moment. "You do this often? Wait around for women you barely know?" He considered that. "No, but I guess you're an exception." She rolled her eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind it. "Where are we going?" He gestured down the street. "There's a coffee shop a couple blocks away. Unless you have somewhere else in mind." She thought about it, then nodded. "Fine." They started walking, the city buzzing softly around them. He glanced at her. "So, do you ever actually slow down?" She let out a breath. "Not really." "Why?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Because I can't afford to." It wasn't just about money, though that was part of it. It was about stability, about making sure she never had to rely on anyone else. He didn't press, which surprised her. Instead, he said everyone needs a break sometimes. She gave him a sidelong glance. "And what about you? You seem like the type who keeps busy." He nodded. "I do. But I'm learning that sometimes taking a step back isn't the worst thing." She arched a brow. "That's some kind of life lesson you picked up recently?" His mouth quirked. "Let's just say I'm working on it." They reached the coffee shop and he held the door open for her. As they stepped inside, she realized something. She wasn't used to this. Not just the ease of conversation, but the way he listened. The way he made it feel like whatever she said actually mattered. And that was dangerous. Elijah didn't get attached easily. Life had taught him that people came and went, and holding on too tightly only led to disappointment. But as he sat across from Zaria in the quiet coffee shop, watching her stir a teaspoon of honey into her tea, he felt something shift. She was guarded, that much was obvious. Every answer she gave was measured, every reaction carefully controlled, but beneath it all, there was something else, a quiet strength that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. She set her spoon down, her fingers lightly tapping the rim of her cup. "So, what's your deal?" He arched a brow. "My deal?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You don't seem like someone who randomly strikes up conversations with strangers. And you definitely don't seem like the type to wait around for someone you just met." He leaned back in his chair, considering his words. "I don't usually." Her lips pressed together for a moment before she said, "So, what makes me different?" He could have given her some easy answer, something smooth and meaningless, but that wasn't what she deserved. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out." Something flickered in her expression, something that told him she wasn't used to people saying things like that without expecting something in return. She exhaled softly and looked down at her drink, her fingers tracing the curve of the mug. "I don't really do this." He didn't need to ask what she meant. "Neither do I," he said. She glanced up, her hazel eyes meeting his. "Then what are we doing?" He thought about that for a moment. "Getting coffee." For the first time, she let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head slightly. "Right?" The conversation could have ended there, but Elijah wasn't ready to let her go just yet. He gestured toward her drink. "So, why honey in tea instead of sugar?" She blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Sugar is too sharp. Honey blends better." He nodded. "Makes sense." She leaned back slightly. "That's it? No debate." He shrugged. "Can't argue with logic." She studied him for a second before saying, "You're different than I expected." He lifted a brow. "Expected how?" She hesitated, then said, "I thought you'd be the kind of guy who says all the right things without meaning any of them." Elijah had spent enough time around people who operated that way to understand why she might assume that about him. But the truth was, he had no interest in pretending with her. "I don't waste time saying things I don't mean," he said simply. Zaria held his gaze for a beat longer before looking back down at her tea. He could tell she wasn't used to this, wasn't used to someone taking their time, asking questions that weren't just polite small talk. And he got the distinct feeling that no one had ever really paid attention to the details of her before. But Elijah wanted to, and that thought alone was enough to unsettle him. Zaria knew she should have left after the first 10 minutes. She wasn't the kind of person who sat around entertaining strangers for hours, especially not ones who made her feel like they could see past the walls she'd spent years building. But Elijah wasn't pressing her for anything. He wasn't trying to impress her or fill the silence with meaningless compliments. He just was. And that was somehow more dangerous than anything else. She took another sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest. "You always this patient?" He tilted his head slightly. "Depends on the person." She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "You're impossible." His mouth quirked slightly at that, but he didn't argue. For a few minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, the low hum of conversation around them filling the spaces between their words. Then, as if the universe wanted to remind her why she didn't do things like this, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, tension tightening her shoulders. Elijah noticed. "Everything okay?" She hesitated, then sighed. "Work stuff." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. He didn't pry, which she appreciated. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "You ever let anyone else handle things for you?" She let out a dry laugh. "Not really an option." He studied her for a long moment before saying, "You don't trust people easily, do you?" Something in her chest tightened. She should have brushed the question off, should have given him some vague answer that didn't invite any more curiosity. But for some reason, she didn't want to lie to him. "No," she admitted. "I don't." He didn't look surprised. Instead, he simply nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense to him. And maybe that was the most dangerous thing of all. The sun had started to set by the time they finally left the coffee shop. The air was cooler now, the city lights flickering on one by one as they walked toward where she'd parked her car. She should have said goodbye then, should have thanked him for the coffee and gone on with her life. But as she reached for her keys, she hesitated. Elijah noticed. Something wrong. She shook her head, then glanced at him. I don't know why I'm still standing here. He watched her carefully. Maybe because you don't want to leave just yet. Her pulse stuttered at that. Because he was right. And that terrified her. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. This is a bad idea. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince her otherwise. He just stood there waiting. And somehow that made it even harder to walk away. Zaria wasn't sure what she was doing. She'd told herself she wouldn't let this happen, wouldn't let him become a distraction. Yet here she was, standing beside Elijah as the streetlights flickered on, the city humming quietly around them. The logical thing would have been to say goodbye and leave. But she hadn't moved. And neither had he. Elijah slipped his hands into his pockets, watching her carefully. He wasn't pushing, wasn't asking for more than she was ready to give. But there was something in his eyes and understanding that made her feel more seen than she was comfortable with. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. I don't know why I'm still here. His voice was calm, steady. You don't have to be. She looked at him, searching for some kind of expectation, but there was none. He wasn't trying to convince her of anything. And that, more than anything, made it impossible to walk away. Before she could think better of it, she found herself asking, do you ever just do something without overthinking it? A slow grin touched his lips, but it wasn't teasing, it was knowing. Not as often as I should. Something about that answer hit too close to home. She let out a breath, glancing at the street ahead of them. I should go. Elijah nodded, but he didn't move. And for some reason, that made it even harder to leave. Zaria tightened her grip on her keys, forcing herself to break the moment. See you around, Elijah. She didn't wait for his response. She couldn't. Because if she did, she wasn't sure she'd be able to walk away. Elijah wasn't used to wanting something he couldn't immediately understand. But Zaria wasn't easy to figure out. And that only made him want to know her more. He hadn't expected to see her again so soon, but life had other plans. A few days later, he found himself at another family gathering, this time a small dinner at his aunt's house. He hadn't planned to stay long, but the moment he stepped through the door, he caught sight of her. She was in the kitchen, speaking quietly with his cousin's wife, her expression serious. She hadn't noticed him yet, and something about that made him pause. She wasn't here for him. She was here because she was working. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder if she'd thought about him since their last conversation. He didn't have to wait long to find out. She turned, catching sight of him near the doorway. For a second, her eyes flickered with something unreadable, surprise, maybe. But she masked it quickly, giving him a polite nod before focusing back on whatever she was discussing. Elijah wasn't sure why that reaction unsettled him. He wasn't used to being ignored. He stepped further into the kitchen, waiting until the conversation ended before speaking. Didn't expect to see you here. Zaria wiped her hands on a towel before facing him fully. Neither did I. Her tone was neutral, but he caught the slight tension in her posture. He leaned against the counter, watching her. So, we're pretending we don't know each other now? She sighed, crossing her arms. I'm working, Elijah. I gather that. She gave him a pointed look. Then you should also gather that I don't have time for distractions. He didn't miss the way she avoided his gaze when she said it. He studied her for a moment before saying, is that what I am? A distraction. Her lips pressed together as if she regretted saying it aloud. But she didn't take it back. She didn't confirm it either. Instead, she turned back to the counter, busying herself with arranging a tray. This isn't a good idea. Elijah tilted his head. What isn't? She let out a breath, finally looking at him. This. He didn't move. Why not? Her fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. Because I don't have time to waste. Who said this would be a waste? She hesitated just for a second. But it was enough. Elijah took a slow step closer, lowering his voice. What are you so afraid of, Zaria? Her jaw tensed. I'm not afraid. Then what? She glanced away, shaking her head. I just don't do this. He didn't push. But he didn't step back either. After a moment, she exhaled sharply, setting the tray down. I have to finish this. Elijah studied her for a beat longer before nodding. All right. He walked away without another word. And even though she didn't watch him leave, he knew she felt it. Because he felt it too. Zaria hated how aware she was of him. Even as she worked, moving from the kitchen to the dining area, she could feel his presence. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't trying to talk to her again. But somehow that made it worse. Because now she was the one thinking about him. By the time the event started winding down, she was restless. She had avoided him the entire evening, but as she packed up the last of her equipment, she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. And sure enough, as soon as she stepped outside to load the van, he was there. He was leaning against his car, arms crossed, watching her. She stopped, exhaling slowly. "Are you waiting for something?" Elijah shrugged. "Just wondering if you'll actually say goodbye this time." She tightened her grip on the bag she was holding. "I already told you." "I know," he interrupted. "You don't do this." He pushed off the car, closing the distance between them. "But here's the thing, Zaria, you already are." Her breath hitched. He didn't touch her. Didn't try to close the last few inches between them. But she felt it anyway. The weight of whatever this was. The pull that neither of them could seem to ignore. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally she whispered, "I don't know how." Elijah's gaze softened, and for the first time she saw something unguarded in his expression. "Then let me show you." She should have walked away. But she didn't. Zaria wasn't the kind of person who let herself get swept up in things. She was practical, focused. Letting emotions dictate her decisions wasn't an option, not when she had worked so hard to build the life she had. And yet here she was, standing too close to Elijah, his words still hanging between them. "Then let me show you." She should have walked away. She knew that. But something about the way he looked at her, steady, unwavering, had her rooted in place. She didn't know how to respond to that kind of certainty. So she did what she always did when things got too close. She put up a wall. "I have to go," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Elijah didn't try to stop her. He didn't reach for her or say something to make her stay. He just nodded once, slow and understanding, like he already knew she would run. And somehow that made it worse. As she turned and walked toward her van, she felt the weight of his gaze on her back. She told herself it didn't matter. But the truth was, it did. More than it should. Elijah knew when to push and when to step back. He'd learned a long time ago that forcing something never worked, and Zaria was a woman who didn't do anything she wasn't ready for. That didn't mean he was going to forget about her. It had been a long time since someone had made him feel this way, like every moment with them mattered. Like each glance, each conversation, each hesitation meant something deeper. So he gave her space. For a few days, he didn't try to see her, didn't text or find an excuse to bump into her by accident. He let her sit with whatever it was she was feeling. But when Daniel mentioned that his wife was helping organize a charity gala and had hired Zaria's catering company again, Elijah knew that waiting had its limits. He wasn't going to let her slip away. Not when he was certain she felt this too. The night of the gala, the venue was buzzing with people in formal attire, laughter and conversation weaving through the space like a current. Elijah wasn't one for these kinds of events, too much small talk, too many people pretending they cared more than they did. But tonight, none of that mattered. Because the moment he spotted Zaria across the room, everything else faded. She was moving through the crowd, speaking briefly with her staff, making sure everything was running smoothly. She was dressed simply black slacks, a crisp white button-down, but somehow, she stood out more than anyone in the room. She hadn't seen him yet. He waited until she stepped to the side, adjusting a tray of hors d'oeuvres, before making his way over. She noticed him immediately. Her breath caught, just slightly, before she straightened, her expression carefully neutral. "You again," she said, her tone even. Elijah slid his hands into his pockets. "You sound surprised." She exhaled, glancing at the room around them before looking back at him. "I shouldn't be." He tilted his head slightly. "Have you been avoiding me?" Her jaw tightened just a fraction. "I've been working." "That's not an answer." Her fingers curled against the edge of the tray, and for the first time he saw something flicker in her expression, something uncertain. "Why are you here, Elijah?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I meant what I said." She swallowed, her gaze darting away for a second before locking back onto his. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he countered. "I know you care about what you do. I know you don't trust easily. I know you're used to handling everything on your own." Her breath hitched slightly, but she didn't look away. Elijah took a small step closer, lowering his voice. "And I know that this scares you." Zaria's lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time, she didn't have a sharp comeback, didn't have a way to deflect. Because he was right. It did scare her. More than she wanted to admit. Someone called her name from across the room, and the moment shattered. She blinked, exhaling shakily before stepping back. I have to get back to work. Elijah didn't stop her. He didn't need to. Because this time she wasn't running. She was just trying to figure out how to stay. Zaria barely made it through the rest of the night without thinking about him. Every time she turned around, she felt his presence lingering even when she couldn't see him. She hated how much space he took up in her mind. By the time the event ended and she was helping pack up, she was exhausted not just physically, but mentally. She needed air. She stepped outside, the cool night breeze brushing against her skin as she leaned against the side of the catering van. She wasn't expecting him to follow her. But of course he did. Elijah stepped out from the side entrance, his gaze finding hers immediately. She sighed, shaking her head. You don't give up, do you? He leaned against the van beside her, close but not too close. Not when something's worth it. Her throat tightened. You don't even know if I am. He turned his head, meeting her gaze fully. I do. The quiet certainty in his voice made her chest ache. She wanted to fight it, wanted to push him away before he got too close. But the truth was, he was already there. She exhaled, looking down at her hands. I don't know how to do this. Elijah was quiet for a moment before he said, Then let's figure it out together. Her breath caught. It would have been easier if he had said something grand, something dramatic. But this was real. And for the first time, she let herself consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do everything alone. She looked up at him, really looked at him, and something inside her cracked open. Maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was exactly what she needed. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to see where it could go. Zaria had spent years keeping people at a distance, but Elijah had slipped past her defenses before she even realized it was happening. Now, standing in the quiet night outside the gala venue, she felt something shift inside her, something she couldn't ignore anymore. The weeks that followed were unlike anything she had ever known. Elijah didn't push, didn't demand more than she was ready to give. But he was there. He showed up again and again, in ways that made it impossible for her to pretend this was something casual. When she had a chaotic day at work, he'd show up at the bakery after hours, leaning against the counter like he belonged there, waiting until she finally sighed and gave in, sharing a late-night cup of tea. When she had an event that ran long into the night, he'd text Daniel's wife to ask if she needed help packing up, showing up without being asked. She wasn't used to that, to the quiet, steady presence of someone who wasn't looking for an easy way out. And that terrified her, because the deeper she fell, the more she realized that if she let this happen, if she let him in completely, there was no walking away untouched. One evening, after an exhausting day of back-to-back catering appointments, she found herself sitting on the hood of his car, a takeout container balanced on her lap. He had shown up at her bakery right as she was locking up, refusing to let her go home without eating something first. She glanced at him, watching as he leaned back against the windshield, eyes on the dark sky above them. You ever think about what you'd be doing if life had gone differently? She asked, surprising even herself. Elijah turned his head slightly, considering her question. Depends. What kind of different are we talking about? She twirled her fork absently in her noodles, thinking. I don't know. If you weren't here, if things had taken you somewhere else. He was quiet for a moment before saying, I used to think I had everything figured out, that I knew exactly where I was going, what I wanted. But now. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. I think maybe I was wrong. She frowned slightly. Wrong how? He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. Because I didn't expect you. Her breath caught. She looked away, focusing on the city lights in the distance. I don't know what to do with that. Elijah didn't reach for her, didn't try to close the space between them. But his voice was steady when he said, You don't have to do anything. Just be here. She swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the takeout container to ground herself. For so long, she had been convinced that love was something that came with conditions, something that required a level of sacrifice she wasn't willing to make. But Elijah made it feel different. Like maybe, for the first time, it wasn't about giving something up. Maybe it was about having something she never thought she could. And that scared her more than anything. One evening, as they stood outside her bakery, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn, She finally found the words that had been stuck inside her for weeks. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah didn't pretend not to understand. He didn't ask her why. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, warm and steady. "I know," he murmured, "but I'm not going anywhere." Something inside her cracked wide open. She had spent so long convincing herself that love wasn't for her, that it was safer to keep her heart locked away. But Elijah had shown her something different, something worth the risk. And as she stepped into his arms, letting herself finally lean into him, she realized she didn't have to protect herself from him, because he had never been the danger. He had been the safe place all along. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to believe in something more.